Dim the lights, close your eyes, and drift back to a year so dreadful, so utterly bleak, that historians have called it the worst year to be alive. No, not the year your favorite TV show was cancelled or when your phone died during a road trip. I'm talking about 536 AD, a year so shrouded in darkness that, for many, it felt like the world itself had ended. But what actually happened, and how did this forgotten catastrophe shape the centuries that followed? Tonight, on History Owl, let's wander through the foggiest depths of time and unravel the mysteries of humanity's true annus horribilis. Plus a few other, boring, disasters that quietly changed everything, while the rest of history snored. Imagine waking up one morning in the heart of the 6th century. The sun rises, or at least, it tries to. But instead of the golden light you expect, there's only a faint, silvery glow filtering through a thick, unnatural haze. It's cold, far colder than usual. Crops wither in the fields. The birds seem confused, perched silently in the trees. For days, weeks, months, the world remains dim and strangely silent. No one can explain it. Kings and peasants alike look up at the pale sky and wonder if the gods have abandoned them. Would you have known this was the beginning of a global disaster? Or would you have simply prayed for spring? Let's pull back the curtain on the year 536. A year so catastrophic that later chroniclers called it the year without sun. Procopius, a historian living through these events in the Eastern Roman Empire, wrote, "During this year, a most dread portent took place. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness like the moon during the whole year." And he wasn't exaggerating. Tree rings from Ireland to China, ice cores from Greenland, and written records from across 3 continents all point to a sudden, drastic drop in temperatures, crop failures, and famine. But what caused it? For centuries, nobody knew. Medieval chroniclers blamed demons, omens, and even the wrath of God. But in recent decades, scientists have pieced together a story just as dramatic as any legend. The culprit? A mysterious volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland or North America, so massive that it shot dust and sulfur high into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight for over a year. Imagine a global cold snap, sudden and merciless. Summer temperatures in parts of Europe dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but for societies already living on the edge, it meant disaster. Food supplies dwindled. The Irish annals say, a failure of bread, for 3 years in a row. In China, summer snow fell, crops failed, and starvation swept the land. In Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, people whispered about monsters in the sky. Panic, fear, and confusion became the new normal. What would you have done, watching the world grow dimmer and colder every day? Would you have clung to hope, or resigned yourself to the end? But the real tragedy was only beginning. In the aftermath of 536, famine and cold weakened populations across Eurasia. And then, just as the world began to recover, another disaster struck, the plague of Justinian. In 541 AD, a deadly new disease, now known as bubonic plague, erupted in the eastern Mediterranean, spreading like wildfire across the weakened population. It killed millions, shattering the great cities of Rome, Alexandria, and Constantinople. Let that sink in for a moment. In just a few years, the world went from darkness and famine to a pandemic that killed up to half the population of some regions. The Roman Empire, already battered, would never truly recover. Peasant uprisings, wars, and migrations followed in the chaos. The so-called Dark Ages weren't just a metaphor. For many, they were a brutal reality. But why does almost nobody remember 536 AD today? Why isn't it in our textbooks, alongside the Black Death or the World Wars? The answer is almost as fascinating as the disaster itself. The people who lived through it didn't know what had happened. There were no global news alerts, no scientists piecing together ice core data. They wrote about the symptoms, the cold, the darkness, the hunger, but not the cause. And so, for centuries, the story of 536 AD faded into the background, lost amid the grander tales of kings and conquests. It's only in the last few decades, as historians and scientists have joined forces, that we've begun to understand the true scale of what happened. In a way, it's the ultimate boring history. A disaster so big, so widespread, that nobody could comprehend it at the time. But 536 isn't alone in this club of catastrophes that history almost forgot. Let's take a gentle detour through a few more boring disasters, the quiet, creeping crises that reshaped civilizations, even as the world barely noticed. Have you ever heard of the Great European Famine of 1315? Probably not. It's overshadowed by the Black Death that followed a few decades later. But in the early 14th century, relentless rains drowned crops from Ireland to Poland. The result was a slow-motion disaster, years of hunger, disease, and death. Entire villages vanished, children were abandoned. Chroniclers tell us that, desperate for food, people dug up roots and chewed on grass. Some even whispered of cannibalism. Yet, despite all this, the famine rarely gets a headline. Why? Because unlike a battle or a plague, famine is quiet. It creeps in, lingers, and leaves scars that last for generations. Or consider the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. You've probably heard of Krakatoa, but Tambora's eruption was even bigger, the most powerful in recorded history. It blasted so much ash into the sky that 1816 became the year without a summer. Snow fell in June in New England. Crops failed across Europe and Asia. In Switzerland, a young Mary Shelley, trapped indoors by the cold, wrote Frankenstein. But for millions of farmers, there were no horror stories, just hunger and hardship. It's a reminder that history isn't just made by kings, generals, or inventors. Sometimes, it's shaped by the slow, relentless forces of nature, volcanoes, climate, disease, that quietly change the course of human events. These are the boring disasters. The ones that don't make for thrilling battle scenes, but that reshape the world in ways we're still trying to understand. So, why is it that these events slip through the cracks of our collective memory? Is it because they're just too overwhelming? Or is it because, deep down, we'd rather tell stories with clear villains and heroes? After all, it's easier to remember the drama of a battlefield than the slow agony of a hungry winter. Yet, when we look closer, these forgotten disasters reveal just how fragile our world really is. Imagine living in a time when a single volcanic eruption, thousands of miles away, could plunge your village into darkness for months. Or when a few years of bad weather could topple kingdoms and erase entire communities. It's humbling, isn't it? We like to think of history as a story of human progress, but sometimes it's nature that holds the pen. Let's return, for a moment, to the world of 536. Picture the city of Constantinople. Marble palaces, bustling markets, the distant echo of church bells. Now imagine it blanketed in a cold, gray fog. The Emperor Justinian sits in his palace, consulting astrologers and priests, desperately searching for answers. But none come. The Byzantine chronicler John of Ephesus writes, "The sun became dark and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow." For nearly 2 years, the people lived in a twilight world, waiting for the sun to return. Further north, in Britain, the legendary King Arthur may have just fallen at Camlan. The Saxons, the Britons, the Picts, all would have faced the same cold, the same hunger. In Scandinavia, archaeologists have found mass graves from this period, suggesting entire communities were wiped out. In China, records speak of yellow dust falling from the sky, of failed harvests and mass migrations. It was a global event, even if nobody at the time knew just how far the darkness stretched. And out of this chaos, the world changed. Old powers crumbled. New religions and cultures rose. In the shadow of disaster, people searched for meaning. Some turned to new gods or prophets. Others migrated, forging new communities far from the lands of their ancestors. In the centuries that followed, the world would look very different, a patchwork of kingdoms, faiths, and peoples, all shaped by the long shadow of 536. It's tempting to imagine that, had you lived in those days, you might have found the answer. Maybe you'd have guessed the sun was blocked by a volcano, or that the famine would one day end. But for most people, there was only confusion, fear, and the daily struggle to survive. And maybe that's the quiet lesson of boring history. That most of the time, real change isn't dramatic or heroic. It's slow, grinding, and often invisible, until, suddenly, it's everywhere. But let's not stop at 536. History is full of years that seemed uneventful at the time, but whose effects rippled out for centuries. Take 1783, for example, when the Laki volcano erupted in Iceland. The eruption lasted 8 months, releasing toxic gases across Europe. The skies turned red, crops failed, and thousands died from famine and poisoning. Benjamin Franklin, then in Paris, wrote of the dry fog that hung over Europe. Some historians even argue that the famine and hardship that followed helped set the stage for the French Revolution. Who would have thought a volcano in Iceland could help topple a king in France? Or think about the so-called Little Ice Age, a period of centuries when average temperatures dipped just enough to make life miserable across the northern hemisphere. Rivers froze in London. Dutch painters captured skaters on icy canals. But for farmers, it meant shorter growing seasons, failed harvests, and, once again, hungry mouths. It's not the stuff of epic movies, but it changed millions of lives. Even in the modern era, history's boring disasters continue to shape our world. In 1816, after Tambora, the darkness and cold led to food shortages in China, India, and Europe. Across the globe, people migrated in search of better land. In North America, the year without a summer pushed settlers west, opening up new territories. In India, failed monsoons triggered drought and famine. The echoes of these quiet catastrophes are still with us. So, the next time you hear someone say that history is just a list of battles and dates, remember the year 536. Remember the silent, invisible disasters that have shaped our world just as much as any war or king. And remember that, sometimes, the most important events are the ones that nobody noticed at the time. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived a journey through the darkest year in history, and a few of its quietly catastrophic cousins. Maybe you're even feeling a little sleepy. That's okay. After all, sometimes the best way to understand history is to let it wash over you, gently and slowly, until you see the world a little differently. If you enjoyed this dive into humanity's forgotten disasters, why not join the History Owl community? Hit subscribe, ring that bell, and let's keep exploring the weird, wonderful, and sometimes very boring corners of history, together. After all, history might not always be dramatic, but it's never, ever dull. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.